Maddie stood barefoot in the dusty yard behind the big red barn, the sun beating down on her small shoulders. The smell of dry hay mixed with engine oil and old iron. She was only 10, but her father's voice still echoed in her head every time she saw the rusted tractor. The ranch owner, Mr. Callahan, shouted orders at the older ranch hands, big men with sunburned necks and heavy boots. They circled the tractor like vultures, arguing whether to sell it for scrap or let it rot behind the shed forever. Maddie tugged the brim of her oversized straw hat lower. She could hear the grown-ups mocking the old machine, cursing the wasted money and time they'd already spent trying to fix it. A few men leaned against the fence, spitting into the dry dirt, already talking about new models and catalogs they couldn't afford. Maddie's mother, Maria, watched from the kitchen window inside the ranch house, her hands red from scrubbing pans. She knew where Maddie's eyes would wander when the men talked machines. Her husband, Maddie's father, had loved this tractor more than any truck on the ranch. He'd promised to teach her every bolt and wire. When Maddie's father died in a roadside accident last winter, the ranch changed. The grown men stopped fixing things themselves and started replacing them instead. The old tools in the back shed stayed locked away, and the small girl with grease on her hands wasn't welcome around heavy equipment anymore. But Maddie never forgot what she learned sitting in her daddy's lap inside the dusty tool shed. She knew what a bad gasket smelled like. She knew the hiss of a cracked fuel line before it screamed. She knew the heartbeat of a tired engine waiting for another chance. Maddie kicked at the dirt with her toes, listening to the men argue. Mr. Callahan, big belly pushing against his leather belt, said the machine was hopeless. He was already planning the next shipment, big new wheels and shiny metal no one would ever learn to fix themselves. Maddie stepped closer to the tractor's giant rear wheel, touching the cracked rubber like she was checking for a pulse. She whispered to it, her small voice carrying through the still air. One ranch hand noticed her, snorted a laugh, and elbowed the man next to him. "Look, the kid thinks she can fix it." The men's laughter rang across the dusty yard like rusty hinges on an old gate. Maddie's ears burned, but she didn't flinch. She could feel her father's old denim jacket wrapped tight around her shoulders, though she wasn't wearing it today. She stepped right up to Mr. Callahan, staring at his boots because his eyes felt too big and angry. She asked in a quiet, steady voice if she could try fixing the tractor. The old man looked at her like she'd asked to fly the moon. One ranch hand spat out his tobacco, shaking his head at the nerve of a child. Mr. Callahan squinted at Maddie, his sunburned face pinched into a skeptical grin. This machine's older than you'll ever be. Grown men couldn't fix it. What makes you think you can?" Maddie's small hands balled into fists at her sides, hidden by the folds of her faded dress. She didn't answer him, just looked over his shoulder at the rusted hood, the faded paint, the promise that somewhere under all that metal was her daddy's voice saying, "Listen close. Machines talk back when you treat 'em right." The men kept laughing, dust swirling around their boots as Maddie stood still as stone. She didn't care about their laughter, their spit, or the heavy boots that kicked up dirt around her bare feet. She only cared about the old shed behind the barn. When Mr. Callahan shrugged and waved his hand dismissively, she took it as a yes. She turned her back on the laughter and walked straight to the tool shed, where her father's toolbox sat untouched under an old tarp. The latch stuck for a second, but then gave way under her tiny hands. Wrenches, sockets, a battered oil can, the smell hit her like a memory that made her stronger. One by one, Maddie lifted each tool, testing its weight in her palm. She wiped off cobwebs, brushed away dried oil flakes, and set them in a neat line on an old feed bag. She knew the men were watching her from the yard, a few of them leaning closer to see what she'd do. She could hear them whispering about wasting time and calling her mother soft for letting her run wild. Maddie didn't listen. She pushed the barn door open wider, dragged the feed bag closer to the tractor, and climbed onto the rusty step, her knees bumping against warm metal. With a deep breath, Maddie grabbed the dented hood and pried it open. The hinges squealed like they hadn't felt daylight in years. Underneath was a mess of wires, hoses, and rusted bolts. Most kids her age would have seen a pile of junk. She saw a heartbeat under dust and time. She ran her hand along the cracked belt, listening for the whisper of old advice in her head. Somewhere behind her, a ranch hand muttered, "She's gonna get hurt." But Maddie just bent over the open engine, the Texas sun baking her back, and whispered, "It's gonna work." Maddie's small hands moved carefully inside the cramped engine bay, her fingers tracing each hose and bolt like she was reading a secret map only she could see. She tugged gently at a loose belt, feeling it slip and slap against her knuckles. She remembered her father telling her, "Feel it, Maddie. Listen before you turn a wrench." She grabbed a small adjustable spanner from the feed bag, wiped it on her skirt, and tightened the bracket until the slack gave a tiny groan of surrender. She didn't look back at the circle of men who'd gone silent behind her. Dust swirled around Maddie's bare legs as the hot breeze carried the smell of old fuel and dry grass. She checked the oil filter next, her brow furrowed in deep focus. She popped it off carefully, peering at the dark sludge that dripped onto her fingers. She glanced around for an empty tin, found one behind the shed, and drained the old oil into it. Her small boots scraped the dirt when she shuffled back with a half-full can of clean oil her father always kept for emergencies. One by one, the old man's secrets returned like echoes inside her mind. While Maddie worked, her mother peeked from the kitchen window, hand pressed to her mouth, afraid but proud. She whispered her late husband's name under her breath as she watched their little girl stand where he once stood. Mr. Callahan leaned forward now, arms crossed over his belly, the laughter gone from his face. One ranch hand nudged the other, his grin replaced by a look of quiet awe. No one offered to help, not because they didn't want to, but because they could see the girl didn't need saving. She owned that rusted machine now. The afternoon sun began its slow slide behind the old barn, casting long shadows over the tractor's battered frame. Maddie wiped sweat from her forehead with her sleeve, leaving a streak of grease across her temple. She moved with patience beyond her years, checking each wire, tapping the fuel line until the stubborn bubble of trapped air bled out with a soft hiss. Her lips moved silently, repeating the words her daddy used when he taught her how a tired machine could talk if you listened. She knew exactly what the engine needed. It needed to remember it wasn't done yet. Mr. Callahan cleared his throat once, but said nothing when Maddie turned a stubborn screw that refused to budge. She pressed her tiny boot against the side for leverage, jaw clenched tight, eyes narrowed like she was wrestling a wild horse instead of an old bolt. Finally, with a sharp creak and pop, the bolt gave way. She let out a short laugh, almost a giggle, that made the men's shoulders drop just a little, tension turning to grudging respect. One old ranch hand tipped his hat, muttering, "Atta girl," under his breath. Maddie didn't notice. She was too deep in the work. The final test came when she pressed her palm to the fuel pump and felt it stutter under her touch. She leaned closer, ear against the warm metal, the world around her fading until she could hear the gentle drip inside. She traced the tiny crack in the rubber line, her father's voice clear as daylight in her memory, telling her how to patch it until a new one could come in. She tore a piece of cloth from the hem of her skirt, tied it tight around the leak, and sealed it with tape she found inside the old toolbox. With every piece checked, every stubborn part coaxed back to life, Maddie climbed up onto the worn seat. Her feet barely reached the clutch, so she perched on the edge, gripping the wheel with hands black with oil and grit. She took a deep breath, looked up at the sky her father loved so much, and turned the key. At first there was only a cough, a groan like an old man waking from a long pain, then a shudder that rattled through the entire yard. Smoke puffed from the exhaust, and the ancient tractor roared back to life. The sound swallowed the hush of the yard. The men who'd once laughed now stared open-mouthed, hats in hand, dust rising around their boots as they shuffled closer. Mr. Callahan stepped forward, his weathered face softening as he watched Maddie sit proud and tall on that rumbling beast. He reached up to rest a hand on the fender, eyes shining with something between disbelief and pride. Maddie grinned down at him, hair sticking to her forehead, engine rumbling beneath her like it had never died. The ranch didn't need a new tractor. It just needed the mechanic's daughter brave enough to believe.